It was an overcast afternoon in downtown Chicago, the kind where the city seemed to hum with a quiet unease. Gray clouds stretched over the skyline like a heavy blanket, and the wind carried the sharp chill of impending rain. Traffic inched along the congested streets, with impatient horns blaring from every direction. Pedestrians, bundled in coats and scarves, hurried along the sidewalks, heads down, their faces grim with the weight of their own busy schedules. The city seemed alive, yet indifferent, pulsing with its own rhythm of chaos. Amid this relentless pace, a bright yellow taxi pulled over to the curb on a bustling corner. The car was modest and slightly worn, its once vibrant paint dulled by years of service. The driver inside was a man of medium build, his salt and pepper hair peeking out from under a simple black cap. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers tapping a steady rhythm as he waited. This was Samir Patel. To the untrained eye, he looked like any other cab driver trying to make a living in the city. His clothes were plain brown slacks, a slightly rumpled shirt, and a wool coat that had clearly seen better days. But his posture was upright, his movements deliberate, and his eyes held a quiet depth, as though he had seen and endured more than most. Samir had been driving a taxi for years, navigating Chicago's labyrinth of streets with a calm efficiency that set him apart. Though he seldom spoke unless spoken to, his passengers often remarked on his kindness, a warm smile here, a thoughtful word there. But today, Samir's smile was absent. His face was calm, but his expression was one of quiet focus, as though he were preparing for something he couldn't yet name. The street corner where he had stopped was one of the busiest in the city, near a cluster of office buildings where workers spilled out during lunch breaks or rushed home at the end of the day. Samir adjusted his cap, glanced at the dashboard clock, and sighed softly. He was waiting for a passenger, a regular client who had called him earlier and requested a pickup. But before the passenger could arrive, trouble came instead. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer strode toward the taxi with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Officer Brandt was a familiar figure in this part of the city, known for his quick temper and an attitude that often rubbed people the wrong way. His uniform was spotless, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but his sharp gaze carried a coldness that made people shrink under his scrutiny. Brandt's eyes narrowed as he approached the cab. To him, the sight of a stationary taxi in this particular spot was more than an inconvenience, it was an offense. He saw Samir through the window and immediately assumed the worst. To Brandt, Samir wasn't a hard-working man waiting for a client. He was just another face in the crowd, another outsider who didn't belong. "Hey, you!" Brandt barked, rapping his knuckles against the driver's side window with unnecessary force. The sound made a few passers-by glance over, curious but unwilling to intervene. "You can't park here. Move it along." Samir lowered the window slightly, his expression neutral. "Good afternoon, officer," he said in a voice that was calm and respectful. "I'm waiting for a passenger. They should be here in a few minutes." Brandt's lips curled into a sneer. "I said move it along," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. "This isn't a parking lot." Samir hesitated, glancing at the empty seat beside him where his leather-bound portfolio rested. He was tempted to explain further, to insist that he wasn't causing any harm, but something in Brandt's gaze warned him that reasoning wouldn't help. "Sir, I won't be long," Samir said carefully. "I'm just doing my job." Brandt stepped closer, his shadow falling over the open window. "Don't talk back," he snapped, his voice low and threatening. "This isn't your country. Follow the rules, or you'll regret it." The words landed like a slap, but Samir didn't flinch. Instead, he met Brandt's gaze with quiet dignity. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension, and the distant sounds of the city seemed to fade into the background. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like Samir was just another immigrant worker being unfairly targeted, a story as old as the city itself. But Samir's silence wasn't one of submission. It was the silence of someone who understood the futility of arguing with a man blinded by his own prejudices. Brandt, mistaking Samir's calm for weakness, smirked and straightened up. "That's what I thought," he muttered, stepping back from the cab. "Move it before I write you a ticket." Samir gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Yes, officer," he said quietly. As Brandt walked away, his boots clicking against the pavement, Samir rolled up the window and exhaled slowly. His hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel before relaxing again. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone like Brandt, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, a sense that this encounter was only the beginning of something much larger. Unbeknownst to Brandt, a woman standing nearby had been watching the entire exchange. She wore a sleek black coat and carried herself with the confidence of someone used to being in control. In her hand, she held a smartphone, its camera angled discreetly toward the scene. Her eyes followed Brandt as he walked away, then shifted back to Samir's cab. Samir adjusted his rearview mirror and caught sight of the woman watching him. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod in unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened. Samir didn't react beyond a faint lift of his brow. He shifted the car into gear, pulled away from the curb, and disappeared into the flow of traffic. As the taxi merged into the bustling streets, the woman lowered her phone and smiled faintly. "This is going to be interesting," she murmured to herself, slipping the phone into her pocket. Samir drove on, his thoughts focused on the day ahead. He had no way of knowing that the events of this afternoon would soon ripple far beyond this busy street corner, setting into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Brandt thought he knew and reveal truths about Samir that no one, least of all Brandt, could have imagined. Today, patience would indeed be tested. But it wasn't Samir's patience that would ultimately break. As Samir navigated the crowded streets of Chicago, the city outside his cab seemed both familiar and distant. This was his daily rhythm: traffic jams, blaring horns, and the occasional impatient passenger. Yet, today's encounter with Officer Brandt lingered in his mind, not as a source of anger but as a reminder of how easily people judged others based on appearances. For years, Samir had learned to remain composed in the face of such moments. He had mastered the art of silence, not out of submission but as a choice. Silence, he often thought, could say more than 1,000 words. And while his exterior projected calm, inside he was always observing, thinking, and preparing. Samir glanced at the portfolio resting beside him on the passenger seat. It was worn but meticulously maintained, its edges scuffed from years of use. The contents inside were far more valuable than the exterior suggested. They held blueprints, sketches, and plans that had taken months to perfect, visions of structures that could reshape skylines. He thought back to the passenger he was on his way to meet. Ms. Eleanor Rhodes, a prominent real estate developer, had been one of the few people who believed in his work. She had called him earlier, her voice sharp and businesslike as always. "Samir, I need you to pick me up at the usual spot," she'd said. "And don't be late. We have a lot to discuss." Eleanor was direct, sometimes to the point of being abrupt, but Samir respected her. She was one of the rare individuals who didn't judge him for his day job or his unassuming demeanor. To her, he wasn't just a taxi driver, he was an architect with ideas that could change the world. The cab slowed as Samir approached the designated corner. Eleanor stood waiting, her tall figure wrapped in a sleek gray coat, a leather briefcase in hand. Her hair, cut into a sharp bob, framed her face in a way that emphasized her piercing eyes. Samir pulled up and stepped out of the cab to greet her, opening the door for her as she climbed in. "Right on time," she said, glancing at her watch. "Good. We've got a lot to cover." Samir nodded as he returned to the driver's seat. "Good afternoon, Ms. Rhodes." "Where to?" "The office," she replied curtly. And step on it. We're running late. As the cab merged back into traffic, Eleanor began reviewing the documents in her briefcase. She barely looked up, her mind clearly preoccupied with the day's agenda. But as they drove, Eleanor noticed something unusual about Samir's expression. He wasn't his usual calm self. There was a faint shadow in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "What's on your mind, Samir?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Samir hesitated before answering. "Nothing important, ma'am. Just an encounter with a police officer earlier. He didn't seem pleased with me waiting at the curb." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Brandt?" she asked knowingly. Samir glanced at her in the rearview mirror, surprised. "You know him?" Eleanor let out a dry laugh. "Everyone in this part of the city knows Brandt. He's been throwing his weight around for years. You're not the first person he's hassled, and you won't be the last." Samir nodded but said nothing. He wasn't the type to dwell on such matters, but Eleanor's comment made him wonder how many others had faced the same treatment. The rest of the drive was spent in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the towering glass building that housed Eleanor's office, Samir parked the cab and stepped out to retrieve her briefcase from the trunk. "Thank you, Samir," Eleanor said as she took the briefcase. "Don't forget, the presentation is tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp. Make sure you're ready." "I'll be there," Samir replied with a small smile. As Eleanor disappeared into the building, Samir returned to his cab. He had a few more hours left on his shift before he could go home and prepare for the presentation. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that today was far from over. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, Samir found himself parked outside a modest diner. He had stopped for a quick meal, hoping to recharge before heading home. The events of the day still played in his mind, but he focused on what lay ahead, the presentation that could change everything. Inside the diner, Samir sat at a corner booth, sipping a cup of coffee as he reviewed the sketches in his portfolio. The lines and angles on the paper were more than just designs, they were dreams given form. But his moment of peace was short-lived. The bell above the diner door jingled, and in walked Officer Brandt. His presence was hard to miss, his tall frame and confident stride commanding attention. Brandt scanned the room, his gaze settling on Samir. Samir felt the weight of Brandt's stare but kept his eyes on the papers in front of him. He hoped the officer would ignore him and move on, but Brandt had other plans. "Well, if it isn't the cab driver," Brandt said loudly, walking over to Samir's booth. "What are you doing here? Counting your tips?" Several patrons glanced over, sensing the tension. Samir looked up, meeting Brandt's gaze with calm composure. "Just having a meal, officer," he said evenly. Brandt smirked and leaned against the booth. "Don't get too comfortable. You people always seem to think you can do whatever you want in the city." Samir's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He wasn't about to let Brandt provoke him. One of the diner staff, a young woman named Carla, approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Brandt glanced at her, his smirk widening. "No problem. Just reminding our friend here to stay in line." Carla frowned but didn't push further. She gave Samir a sympathetic look before returning to the counter. Samir watched Brandt walk away, his step slow and deliberate, as though he wanted to make sure everyone noticed him. Once Brandt was gone, Samir exhaled and returned to his work. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. Tomorrow's presentation was too important, and he was determined to prove that his vision could speak louder than any prejudice or insult. The late afternoon sunlight glared off the tall buildings, painting the Chicago streets in a wash of golden hues. The hum of the city continued uninterrupted, but on one bustling corner, a scene was unfolding that began to draw attention. Officer Brandt's posture was rigid, his stance one of dominance as he towered over Samir's taxi. His sharp eyes scanned Samir like a predator sizing up its prey. For Brandt, this wasn't just about enforcing the rules. It was about control, about asserting his authority over someone he assumed wouldn't push back. "License," Brandt demanded, his voice heavy with contempt. He didn't just ask, he barked the word like an order. Samir, seated behind the wheel of his modest cab, maintained his composed demeanor. He reached into the glove compartment and retrieved his wallet, pulling out the necessary documents. "Here you go, sir," he said evenly, extending them through the open window. The calmness in Samir's tone seemed to irritate Brandt even more. He snatched the documents and began inspecting them, his eyes narrowing as he read the name printed on the driver's license. "What kind of name is this?" Brandt asked, holding the license up as though it were evidence of some wrongdoing. His lips curled into a sneer. "Doesn't sound local." Samir's lips curved into a faint, polite smile. "It's Indian," he explained. "I moved here several years ago. This is home now." "Home," Brandt echoed with a smirk. "You people always say that. But I bet you don't know how things work around here, do you?" Samir said nothing, choosing to let the officer's words hang in the air rather than dignify them with a response. His silence was deliberate, his expression one of quiet endurance. The subtle tension between the two men was palpable, and it began to attract the attention of passers-by. A few pedestrians slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Among them was a woman in a sleek black suit, her polished appearance standing out among the crowd. Her phone was in her hand, camera pointed discreetly toward the interaction. The woman's eyes darted between Samir and Brandt, her expression a mix of concern and intrigue. She seemed to sense that this was more than just a routine traffic stop. Brandt, oblivious to the recording, continued his scrutiny. "Let's see what you've got here," he muttered, flipping through Samir's documents with exaggerated slowness. "Driving a cab, huh? Guess that's about all you can handle." Samir's fingers tightened briefly on the steering wheel, the knuckles turning white for a moment before he forced himself to relax. Inside the cab, on the passenger seat, rested a leather portfolio. Its worn exterior gave little indication of its importance, but to Samir, its contents were priceless. Brandt finished his inspection with a dismissive grunt and handed the documents back through the window. "Everything looks fine, for now," he said, though his tone suggested he was still searching for something to pin on Samir. "But let me tell you something, stay in your lane. Don't think you can just park anywhere and expect no consequences." "Of course, officer," Samir replied, his voice steady. Brandt leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You're just a driver. Don't forget that." For a moment, Samir's calm faltered. Not outwardly, his expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A spark of something deeper, something that Brandt couldn't begin to comprehend. The woman recording the exchange took a small step forward, her phone capturing every word. She made no effort to intervene, but her presence was not lost on Samir. He noticed her out of the corner of his eye and gave her the faintest nod of acknowledgement. Brandt, however, remained unaware. "Now move it," he barked, stepping back from the cab. "Or I'll write you up for obstructing traffic." Samir nodded. "I'll be on my way." As he started the engine, Samir's calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, but each encounter left a mark. Brandt might see him as just a driver, but Samir knew better. He eased the taxi into traffic, the engine's low hum blending with the noise of the city. His thoughts, however, were anything but quiet. Each insult, each sneer, echoed in his mind, not as a source of anger but as fuel, a reminder of why he had chosen to fight for his dreams. Behind him, Brandt stood on the sidewalk, watching the cab disappear into the distance. His smirk remained, but there was a flicker of unease in his expression. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, as though the final chapter of the story had yet to be written. The woman in the black suit lowered her phone, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. Then, turning on her heel, she disappeared into the crowd. As Samir drove through the bustling streets, his grip on the steering wheel loosened, and his breathing steadied. He glanced briefly at the leather portfolio on the passenger seat. Inside were his architectural designs, blueprints for projects that could transform skylines and change lives. To most, he was just a cab driver. But Samir knew his worth. He had spent years working tirelessly, balancing long hours behind the wheel with late nights at his drafting table. His talent and vision had earned him opportunities that others could only dream of, opportunities he intended to seize, no matter how many Officer Brandt stood in his way. The city unfolded before him, its towering skyscrapers casting long shadows over the streets below. Samir's destination was a modest studio on the city's outskirts, where he often worked on his designs in peace. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could shed the label of driver and embrace his true identity. But today, the sanctuary would have to wait. There was a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, a presentation that could change everything. Eleanor Rhodes, the influential real estate developer, had placed her faith in him, and he was determined not to let her down. As the taxi merged into the flow of traffic, Samir's mind remained focused. Brandt's words had stung, but they had also strengthened his resolve. He knew that people like Brandt would always exist, those who judged others without knowing their stories. But Samir also knew that actions spoke louder than words. And tomorrow, he intended to let his work do the talking. Samir maneuvered through the labyrinthine streets of Chicago, his thoughts a symphony of determination and quiet reflection. The steady hum of the taxi engine was a comforting rhythm beneath the cacophony of the city. Passengers hailed cabs, children darted across crosswalks, and the world carried on as though nothing remarkable had happened. But inside Samir's cab, a different kind of energy thrived. Brandt's words echoed in his ears, not as wounds but as reminders of the barriers he had already overcome. He glanced again at the leather portfolio beside him, its weight feeling heavier than usual. Inside were sketches that spoke of dreams too grand to be contained by the confines of his taxi. Designs for soaring skyscrapers, elegant community centers, and sustainable housing projects lay folded within, waiting for their moment to shine. Tonight, he would refine those designs yet again. Tomorrow, he would stand before a panel of influential figures, presenting a vision he had poured his soul into. It was a chance to reclaim the respect that Brandt and others had so easily denied him. Samir's phone buzzed in the holder attached to the dashboard, pulling him from his reverie. The screen lit up with a notification from Eleanor Rhodes, the developer who had given him a chance. "Eleanor Rhodes, looking forward to your presentation tomorrow. You're going to impress them, Samir. Let's make this city better together." Her faith in him was unwavering, and it bolstered his spirit. Elsewhere in the city, the woman in the black suit, who had recorded the confrontation, reviewed her footage. She sat in a chic coffee shop, her laptop open as she uploaded the video to a folder. Her name was Lisa Monroe, an investigative journalist with a penchant for uncovering stories others overlooked. Lisa had a knack for identifying moments of injustice, even the ones that seemed insignificant at first glance. Watching the video again, she noted the calm in Samir's demeanor and the venom in Brandt's words. There was a story here, one she intended to uncover. As the video played, Lisa found herself wondering about the man in the taxi. His silence wasn't submission, it was calculated. There was something about him that didn't align with Brandt's assumptions. "Who are you, Samir Patel?" she muttered, sipping her latte. Her curiosity deepened as she zoomed in on the portfolio visible in the passenger seat. She paused the video and scrutinized the details. The worn leather, the bulging edges. It wasn't just a portfolio. It was the kind of item that held ideas, plans, or dreams. Lisa leaned back in her chair, the wheels in her mind turning. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing notes. Meanwhile, Samir pulled into his driveway, a modest single-story house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The warm glow of porch lights greeted him as he stepped out of the taxi, the portfolio clutched tightly in his hand. Inside, the house reflected his personality, minimalist yet thoughtful. A drafting table dominated one corner of the living room, surrounded by shelves filled with books on architecture and urban planning. A framed photo of his late wife sat on the mantel, her smile a constant source of inspiration. Samir set the portfolio on the drafting table and carefully unfolded its contents. Blueprints and sketches spilled out, each one meticulously detailed. He reviewed them with a critical eye, making minor adjustments here and there. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his daughter, Priya. "Priya, good luck tomorrow, Dad. Mom would be so proud of you." The message brought a lump to his throat. Priya, now in college, had always been his biggest supporter. He replied with a simple, heartfelt message. "Samir, thank you, beta. I'll do my best." As the hours ticked by, Samir worked tirelessly, refining his presentation. The weight of expectations was heavy, but it was a burden he welcomed. Back at the police precinct, Officer Brandt sat at his desk, scrolling through social media. His face darkened as he stumbled upon a video the one Lisa Monroe had uploaded to her private account. It wasn't public yet, but Lisa's network of contacts had ensured it reached the right people first. Brandt watched the footage, his jaw tightening as he recognized himself. The recording captured every sneer, every cutting remark. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, slamming his hand on the desk. A colleague glanced over. "Problem, Brandt?" "Just some nonsense," he snapped, closing the video. But inside, unease was brewing. He didn't like being under scrutiny, especially when his behavior was on full display. Brandt's discomfort grew as he realized the video was gaining traction among certain circles. He resolved to find out more about Samir Patel and put an end to any trouble before it began. Morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Samir dressed in his best suit, a simple but well-fitted ensemble that exuded quiet confidence. The leather portfolio was carefully packed, its contents organized and ready. As he locked his front door and approached his taxi, Samir felt a surge of anticipation. Today wasn't just about proving himself, it was about showing that his worth went far beyond the labels others had placed on him. The presentation was scheduled at a prestigious downtown venue. Eleanor Rhodes had secured a prime spot for him to showcase his vision to a panel of developers and investors. It was a room filled with power, and Samir intended to make his presence known. Samir arrived early, parking his taxi discreetly before entering the venue. The lobby buzzed with activity, attendees dressed in sharp suits and designer dresses. Samir felt a few curious glances in his direction but paid them no mind. As he made his way to the conference room, he crossed paths with Lisa Monroe. She recognized him instantly and approached with a friendly smile. "Mr. Patel?" she asked. Samir paused, his expression curious but guarded. "Yes. My name is Lisa Monroe. I believe we have a story to tell." Samir studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps we do. If you'd like, I can continue building the tension and weaving all the elements together to hit the desired word count and create a compelling climax." As Samir spread the blueprints across the polished conference table, the room's tension shifted into palpable anticipation. The executives leaned forward, their curiosity piqued by the intricate designs. Each blueprint was a masterpiece, art and engineering woven together in perfect harmony. Samir's vision for the city wasn't just about structures, it was about creating spaces that breathed life, connected communities, and inspired awe. "This," Samir began, his voice calm but confident, is not just a building. It's a symbol of what Chicago can achieve when we dare to think beyond convention. His words were met with murmurs of approval. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with silver-rimmed glasses, pointed to a particular sketch. "These energy-efficient designs, revolutionary. How did you come up with this?" Samir smiled faintly. "Years of observing and listening. People don't just need homes or offices, they need places that adapt to them. Places that respect their needs and the environment." Meanwhile, Lisa Monroe, the woman in black, was far from idle. After her encounter with Officer Brandt, she had wasted no time sharing the video on a platform frequented by local activists and community leaders. The footage gained traction faster than she anticipated. Comments poured in. "This is the kind of behavior we need to expose. Who is the taxi driver? He handled it with so much grace. That officer needs to be held accountable." Lisa knew she had ignited a spark, but she also understood the importance of timing. She began digging deeper into Samir's background, using her journalist contacts to piece together his story. Her search led her to an architectural journal where a younger Samir was featured on the cover. The headline read, "Visionary Architect Redefines Urban Spaces." Back in the conference room, Samir concluded his presentation with a series of slides detailing cost projections and community benefits. The executives exchanged glances, impressed. Eleanor Rhodes, the developer who had championed Samir's designs, stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "what you've just seen isn't merely architecture. It's a commitment to a better future for our city. I trust I'm not the only one who sees the value in this." One by one, heads nodded. The project was unanimously approved, and Samir's designs were greenlit for development. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor approached Samir. "You did it," she said, her tone warm. Samir chuckled softly. "We did it? Your belief in me made this possible." Eleanor shook her head. "No, Samir. Your talent and perseverance brought us here. Never forget that." While Samir basked in his success, Brandt's unease grew. The video of their encounter had reached his precinct, and whispers of an internal investigation were already making rounds. His supervisor, Captain Harris, summoned him to the office. "Brandt," Harris began, his voice stern, "do you know what's making the rounds on social media right now?" Brandt feigned ignorance. "No, sir." Harris slid a tablet across the desk, playing the video for Brandt. The officer's face tightened as he watched his own sneers and condescension on full display. "This kind of behavior," Harris said, "is unacceptable. I've received calls from city officials demanding action. You better have a good explanation." Brandt stammered. "That guy, he's just a cab driver." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Is he? Because I've been hearing otherwise. Do you have any idea who you were talking down to?" Brandt's silence was answer enough. Lisa's investigation bore fruit as she uncovered more about Samir's life. Born in a small village in India, he had shown an exceptional aptitude for design from a young age. After earning a scholarship to study architecture in the United States, he quickly rose to prominence in the field. However, personal tragedy struck when his wife fell ill. Samir left his high-profile career to care for her and their daughter. After her passing, he had struggled to return to the industry, facing countless rejections despite his impeccable credentials. Lisa's article began to take shape, painting a picture of resilience and brilliance. She titled it, "The Architect Behind the Wheel, Samir Patel's Journey from Skyscrapers to Taxi Rides." As the article gained attention, Samir's story began to circulate among Chicago's elite. Invitations to interviews, panel discussions, and exhibitions poured in. But while Samir's life was taking a positive turn, Brandt's was unraveling. The officer, desperate to salvage his reputation, decided to confront Samir directly. One evening, as Samir parked his taxi outside his home, Brandt appeared, his demeanor tense.